Mohan, thank you for those rather too kind words of introduction. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here as the Minister of Trade of the only country in the Commonwealth which is also a member of the European Union. An interesting position to be in, given all of the commentary about the travails of the Eurozone in particular. It is a great privilege to be doing the job I'm doing as a retired banker. When I did get that call from David Cameron, it didn't take me quite as long as a few days, but I did want to understand what the job involved. And I have to say that for the 9 months that I've been doing this, I've had a hugely stimulating set of experiences. I believe there are tremendous opportunities in world trade, and indeed I believe that it is central to Britain's economic growth going forwards that we engage more effectively than we have done in the past in the global international commercial environment. In fact, what I want to do is just spend a few minutes on the lessons that I believe we have learned coming out of the global financial crisis, and the challenges but also the opportunities that I think we all face, and a little bit on the role that the Commonwealth can play in all of this. The background to this is well known to all of us: the shift in global power, the shift in relative market importance of different economies, the shift often characterized as a shift of the centre of gravity from west to east, although it's as much about a shift from north to south as well. It's gathering pace. There are many lessons from the global financial crisis that struck in 2007, 2008. They're still being learnt. Technical lessons about how you ensure a stable and robust banking system globally. Lessons for banking supervision. Lessons for the way in which bank accounting principles work, and so forth. And much soul searching is going on as we seek our way forwards to an international consensus on all of this. But the most important lesson is that the shift of centre of gravity, so far from having been derailed or slowed in any way by that crisis, has actually accelerated. By the year 2050, China, India, Brazil, Mexico and Indonesia will all number amongst the world's 10 largest economies. This is a global revolution. It's not completely unprecedented in history, and for those of us with a sufficiently long memory of historical perspectives, we will remind ourselves that in 1820 the largest economy in the world was China and the second largest was India. We're about to see the re-emergence of such a world. And in a way, the emerging markets are more correctly described as re-emerging markets or re-emerging world powers than they are as just emerging markets. What is clear is that the international organizational architecture is changing rapidly and will need to change rapidly in order to adjust to these new global economic realities. We've already moved from a G8 world to a G20 world. I think it is clear that historians writing in 20, 30, 40 years' time will look back on this period and see the emergence of the G20 as the sign of something profound. It is no longer the case that a club of rich countries could gather together, pretend to solve the world's problems, or claim to solve the world's problems, and then announce to a waiting rest of the world what those answers were. No, the composition of the G20 is a sign that we have a world now in which we have to engage a much broader constituency to discuss the world's challenges and problems. There are other lessons too coming out of the crisis which still need to be learned. Lessons that go to the real economy, because the background to the financial crisis was, as it always is, imbalances in the real economy. And at the global level, what I think we would all now recognize is that the world's economy in the run-up to the crisis was becoming more and more unbalanced. There were large economies that were exporting too much and saving too much and spending too little, and other large economies which were doing the mirror image of that, spending too much, borrowing too much, saving too little and investing too little. And that imbalance needs to rebalance over the next few years if we are to have a sustainable growth path for the next generation. What is true globally is also true for individual economies. And in the case of the British economy, if I may dwell on that for a moment, it is very clear that our most important lesson coming out of the crisis was a similar need at our national level to rebalance. We were an economy which was, in the run-up to the crisis, growing too much on the basis of consumption fueled by debt and on the basis of government spending growing. And what we all know is that that is not a basis for sustainable growth going forwards. We also know that the economics textbooks tell us that if you can't grow on those bases, then there are only two other sources of demand which can drive an economy sustainably, that is trade and investment. And it is the rebalancing of our economy towards a broader base of production and a more effective engagement internationally that is our principal economic challenge. The British government is very clear on what it needs to do about this. Firstly, we're embarked on a clear programme of fiscal consolidation aimed at balancing the books of the government by 2015. Secondly, we have reformed macroeconomic management so that we can manage the flow of credit through the economy, through the cycle, more effectively than was done before. Thirdly, we are committed to a business-friendly tax environment to support both domestic and foreign direct investment in our economy. Fifthly, we're clearly focused on trade and investment as central to sustainable growth going forwards. Sixthly, we will invest in skills and innovation. And lastly, we will reform and are reforming the planning system so far as it bears on the ability of businesses to invest and the ability of the country to put in place a 21st century economic infrastructure. We're very clear on what needs to be done. We know that we're doing this against a background of international conditions which are not exactly hospitable, and yet we also know that there is no alternative. The background is not as hospitable as we would like for the obvious reason that we sit on the doorstep of the Eurozone, and 47% of our exports go to the Eurozone. Whilst I don't think you could find a single vote in our country now for joining the Euro, we also know that we are not unaffected, to say the least, by the travails of the Eurozone. And it is very clear that not only does the world need a global rebalancing, not only does the UK need a rebalancing of its economy, but the Eurozone needs a rebalancing too. Much has been said about the Eurozone and its difficulties at the moment, and much will be said over the next day or two in the context of this forum, of course. I would simply say that financial stabilisation is both necessary and also not sufficient. It is clear that the Eurozone needs, and indeed the European Union as a whole needs, structural reform to increase its potential for real economic growth. There is a need for rebalancing in the Eurozone. As we go forward with this strategy in difficult international circumstances, it is worth, I think, for us all, holding firm to certain key principles, the compass points of our policy, which happen to represent the essence of what the Commonwealth is all about in so many ways. Free trade, our values and the wider freedoms that support trade, and the partnerships based on shared interests and values that enable us to tackle more effectively the global challenges that we all face, not only in economics and finance, but in the much broader, more profound areas of, for example, of course, climate change. Free trade first. The single biggest driver of the emerging powers revolution in the last 20 years has been the embracing of free market economics and the remarkable opening up of world trade. This has lifted more people out of poverty in our lifetimes than any amount of international aid could have hoped to achieve. To be clear, international aid has an important role to play, but there's no question that opening up economies after economy to world trade is the main driver of growth, both domestically and internationally. In China alone, some 600 million people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 15 years or so. In India, where 20 years ago 1 in every 2 people were living on less than $1 a day, the UN now estimates that by 2015 it will be closer to 1 in 5. Still some way to go, but a huge stride from where India was just 20 years ago. All of this presents all of us with big opportunities. So far as my country is concerned, the free trade reflex is hardwired into the national consciousness. It has been an instinct and an orientation of ours for decades. We believe that the growth of the emerging powers simply reinforces that need to be open to the currents of world trade. One of the first tasks of the UK coalition government, while seeking to reduce our budget deficit, was to make certain that we have measures in place to reap the benefits of free trade and investment. That is why, for example, we're committed to having a lower rate of corporation tax than any other major world economy. It's why we're keen to introduce and maintain the sorts of measures which allow the World Bank and the Economist Intelligence Unit to conclude, as they do currently, that the UK is the easiest place to do business in Europe and the 4th easiest globally. Values and freedoms matter too, of course. Economic liberalisation will inevitably be followed by more open societies and greater political pluralism. Our own history suggests this. Likewise, the astonishing liberalisation that has taken place in the politics of Latin America in tandem with their economic development in a very short space of time. I would argue that the same is true of Southeast Asia. Compare Indonesia and Malaysia with Burma, for example. Freedom and prosperity creating new opportunities for ordinary people. So our approach to the emerging powers is guided above all by the belief that these values are not the preserve of some particular club of wealthy nations. They are actually universal to humankind. The events of the Arab Spring bear this out, of course. The struggles for democracy in the Middle East and North Africa resonate across the world, including here in the Asia-Pacific region. In our interconnected world, events on the other side of the globe matter to all of us. We believe that it's important to build new partnerships for the New World Order. The independency goes both ways. In the New World Order, countries will need to form partnerships based on shared interests and values to deal with global issues that affect us all. And so to draw on the three guiding principles of free trade, values and forging relationships, I think we can all see how these are all brought into focus by the role that the Commonwealth is now playing in the 21st century. This network of 54 countries is a ready-made multilateral grouping that delivers for all of its members the promotion of free trade, the support for democracy, good governance, the protecting and projection of human rights, and engagement on the most pressing issues that face the planet, notably, of course, climate change. Commonwealth trade is becoming an increasingly obvious phenomenon. Countries such as India, Malaysia, South Africa, Singapore and Nigeria represent some of the fastest growing and technologically advanced economies of the world, great markets of today and tomorrow. And trade in the Commonwealth is growing. 3 trillion worth of trade every year between Commonwealth members. Over 200 billion of investment in Commonwealth countries over the last 10 years. And the middle class of the Commonwealth has expanded by nearly $1 billion in the last 20 years. The facts speak for themselves. Finally, on the subject of climate change, one of the most pressing issues, perhaps the most pressing issue of our time. It respects no national borders. It is likely to increase extreme weather conditions over the next generation. Here in Australia, we have seen the devastation caused by floods and cyclones and bushfires. In Pakistan, we saw 5 million people affected by flooding for a second consecutive year, wreaking havoc to communities and livelihoods. We cannot ignore this global phenomenon. Climate change is a shared challenge, and the readiness and ability of the Commonwealth nations to work together to deal with its impacts can play a defining role in our place in the world of the 21st century. We all know that the poorest countries are the ones that will be hit hardest by this. 32 of the world's smallest and most vulnerable states belong to the Commonwealth, almost 60% in fact of its membership. And with half of the Commonwealth population under 25 years old, the Commonwealth needs to step up and play its full part in the realisation of a low-carbon future. Indeed, we surely have a moral responsibility to our people, whether it's in India, our largest member, or Nauru, our smallest. All of this is a powerful reminder that the major economies have to take decisive action in cutting carbon emissions and finding a way to a sustainable green economic growth path. Business, finally, has a crucial role to play in all of this. Governments can and should put in place the policies that give clear direction, but it is business that is going to make the difference. Many companies and countries already understand the opportunities offered by a low-carbon future. The global market for low-carbon and environmental goods and services reached over £3 trillion in 2010 and is expected to reach £4 trillion by 2015. All in all, I think you can see how a Commonwealth Business Forum allied to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting offers us a chance to engage on these issues of fundamental importance to us all, whether we're talking about the financial turbulence that troubles us in the short term, or whether we're talking about finding our way forwards collectively to a globally sustainable growth path. These are challenging times, but they're also exciting times, and I thank you for listening. Thank you.